Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Lauren Gross. For those of you who don't know me already, I'm the director of the Gross Family Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Dr. Michael Bornstein is one of the youngest survivors of the Auschwitz death camp. At the age of 4, he evaded murder in the most notorious death camp in world history. Photos of Michael at liberation have been spotted on museum walls, book covers, and film clips around the world, and yet he waited more than 70 years to step forward and share his story publicly. He wrote Survivors Club alongside his third of 4 children, Debbie Hollenstadt, who's here beside him. Along the way, he and his family were stunned to uncover the shocking details about his survival that included a bribery scheme, untold acts of kindness by a German leader, and one perfectly timed brush with illness. Michael is a graduate of Fordham University in New York and holds a PhD in pharmaceutics and analytical chemistry from the University of Iowa. He spent 4 decades helping to develop life-changing drug treatments for major pharma companies, including Dow Chemical, Eli Lilly, and Johnson & Johnson. Now semi-retired, Michael spends much of his time shuttling between New York and New Jersey, alongside his wife, who's also alongside him this evening, of 50 years, visiting their 11 grandchildren. Debbie Hollenstadt, Michael's daughter, is a TV news producer and media coach. She spent her career writing for some of the biggest names in broadcast news, including Lester Holt of NBC, CNN's Ashley Banfield, and the Today Show's Natalie Morales. But her greatest professional reward has come from writing alongside her father as they collaborated on this narrative nonfiction bestseller. A story with twists so shocking, even her father was stunned by revelations learned in their research. Debbie is also a wife and mother of 3. Her entire family takes comfort in knowing that as firsthand Holocaust accounts from aging survivors fade away fast, this story will not. Please welcome Debbie Hollenstadt and Dr. Michael Bornstein.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. I want to thank the JCC, the Jewish Federation, and our sponsor, Lauren Gross, and the Gross family for the study of anti-Semitism. What you do in fostering remembrance is so important. I've been traveling around the country on a book tour for almost a year now. This should be getting easier, but it's not. This is not comfortable, standing in front of big groups talking about what happened to me as a child. For most of my life, I preferred to just focus on the future. I have a happy life. As Lauren mentioned, I have a wonderful wife. We've been married for over 50 years now. 4 terrific kids. And you mentioned 11 grandchildren. It's really 12 now.
You were right when we first started, but now it's 12. It wasn't.
But I'm one of the survivors, one of the youngest survivors alive today. I can't stay silent anymore. I was prisoner B-1148. Show you my tattoo. I expect you've seen tattoos before. This one is at Yad Vashem in Israel and a number of other places. At 4 years old, I wore a prisoner uniform. I was starving, too malnourished to grow hair. I slept on a wood plank, hiding under straw. There were bed bugs and rats everywhere. I was ripped away from my mother, my father, and my big brother, Shlomo. After the war, I was sick, bullied, and I was sexually assaulted. My memories from Auschwitz are extremely fuzzy, but I do seem to remember the smell. It always smelled like burning flesh. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear boots marching and voices shouting in German. As an adult, I get nervous on crowded New York City subways thinking about a cramped cattle car ride to Auschwitz. It's not easy to talk, but I won't stop. I've been incredibly nervous lately. There's been a spike in anti-Semitic bullying in schools, white nationalists holding rallies, swastikas painted on synagogues and school walls. I realize if the haters and deniers are making noise in my country, I need to shout louder. I need to shout clearer, and I need to shout stronger. I'm telling you my story today because no one can ever forget what happens when discrimination of any kind is ignored. So after tonight, I hope that you'll read my book. Actually, Debbie is the writer, and she's a fantastic writer. And share it with others, and help me ensure that no one ever forgets what happened to my family, and to the 6 million murdered simply because they were Jewish. And now a few words from Deborah.
So I also want to, oh, so sorry.
Got one. How about that? Better? Is this good? Okay. So I want to thank Lauren as well, and her dad, and the Gross Family Center for Studying Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, Federation and JCC as well. This is actually our third talk today. I say this not with exhaustion, although probably a little bit, maybe a little bit of exhaustion, but I say it really more with pride. You may have noticed my dad said he didn't talk about the Holocaust. He didn't talk for 7 decades about the Holocaust. And in just the last year, since Survivors Club was released, we've traveled to Washington, D.C., Illinois, Missouri, Minnesota, Indiana, New York, Pennsylvania, Iowa, appeared on CNN, NBC, MSNBC, NPR, and my dad's been interviewed for countless magazine and newspaper articles. When he decided it was time to talk, it was time to talk. Almost without fail, I think, the first question every single interviewer always asks is, why did you finally decide to speak now? And the reasons are many for my dad. His grandkids were pushing him to talk. He might have said no to me for years, but he never ever says no to his grandkids. He also saw a Holocaust denial website using his liberation photo to deny that children were ever mistreated at Auschwitz. He has the wisdom that comes with age of knowing that silence is never the answer to tragedy. There are a lot of good reasons to talk now. But here's the thing. I'm probably not the most spiritual person in the room. I'm a high holiday Jew, I guess they call me. I'll be one with extreme pride in my religion, my identity, and the state of Israel. But I have never really considered myself deeply spiritual until recently. I've decided the timing of this book release was no accident. My dad happened to step into the light during a year when the alt-right white supremacists marched in the streets in Charlottesville. And I don't know if you're aware, they're organizing another rally. They're trying to plan an anniversary rally for this summer. It's a time when in Poland, Poland is poised to put into effect a law that would make it illegal for anyone to imply the country or countrymen were in any way complicit in Holocaust crimes. A threat to survivors like my dad and others who don't sugarcoat what happened in 1940s Europe. It's a time when anti-Semitic bullying in schools has multiplied exponentially, and hate crimes against not just Jews, but Muslims, Hispanics is through the roof. So I do wonder if the timing of my dad's decision to step into the light is maybe a little bit guided. I know this much. There has never been a better time in modern history to remind people what happens when power goes unchecked and bigotry is ignored. And one more thing, I always tell this to kids, but the reality is, like even as an adult, I always make this analogy, but even as an adult, I struggle with the number, the big number, 6 million Jews. killed in the Holocaust. Right next door at Meyer Academy, they have a big bin where they're collecting 6 million pennies. So they have like a visual. But even that doesn't really convey the number. And I know you guys were all touched. This state was touched by tragedy this month. Around the country, way up north, we felt it too. What happened in Parkland, 17 innocent people killed. There would have to be a Parkland massacre every 30 minutes around the clock for more than 20 straight years to equal the death toll from the Holocaust. And I say that not at all to minimize what happened in Parkland, because my heart absolutely breaks thinking about it. But I say that because we've seen their pictures flash on the screen, those 17, and we are, at this moment in time, very aware that each of those 17 lives was a person. 6 million people were killed. And with that, we want to take you through my father's story. We're blessed that not only did my father survive, but a lot of photos survived the Holocaust as well.
Okay, so on the left, you see a picture of some of my family. My father, Israel Bornstein, was a successful accountant. And my mother, Sophie, loved to sing, dance, and act. And we had a tight-knit, Orthodox Jewish family.
That's my grandma Sophie, my dad's mom, on the bottom right there with the white hat. And this is her with some of her siblings, my dad said. And as he said, it was a tight-knit family. My grandma Sophie had 6 brothers and sisters. They were a large family that all lived pretty close by, of 7 siblings.
So here we see a map of Poland, and towards the center, south side, you see Jarki highlighted. That is the town where I was born. And just to the north of Jarki is Częstochowa, which is a town that we'll talk about later on. This is where they had Matka Boska, the Black Madonna, in the town. And just south of there, you see Krakow and Auschwitz.
Jarki was a town of about 34, it was about 6,000 people, and about 3,400 of them were Jewish. So it was predominantly Jewish town. And though there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland at the time, just before the war, it was actually one of the better places to live. And the family had a pretty happy life there. One of the things we learned in our research, though, is that Jarki was one of the first towns invaded when the war started. And within 24 hours of declaration of war, there were planes flying overhead dropping bombs. Within 48 hours of that, there were boots on the ground in Jarki. And actually, we learned that was not necessarily by design. It was sort of a terrible accident. I just learned, it's not in the book because I just learned this recently, the Polish troops were retreating. And they tucked themselves into, when the war first started, they tucked themselves into Jarki, and they saw German observation planes flying overhead about 12 hours after the war started. And they made a really stupid decision. They went out and started shooting at the planes, which did nothing to the planes. But within a few hours of that, bombers returned and unleashed a terrible destruction on the town. And September 4th, 1939 is remembered in the town as Bloody Monday. Among the atrocities committed on that day, the German soldiers, the Wehrmacht, would come in and they would line up whole families of people, and they made it like a game. They would have them hold up their arms, and if they got tired and they lowered their arms, they were shot. Several families were killed in that day, in that way. Another thing that happened is my grandma Sophie, my dad's mom, wanted to check on her own parents, and so she took a shortcut through the Jewish cemetery, and she witnessed something that would haunt her.
Yes, my mother tells us a story about going towards her parents' house and seeing a Nazi soldier with a Jewish family. He asked the man to dig a hole. He asked the family to undress, to hug, and he shot them all and put them into that pit. And my mother just couldn't stop talking about that. She remembers that all the time.
It was a mother, father, and a little girl, a toddler.
This is a picture, again, of the swastika, the Nazi symbols, and the Jewish simple Yudah. The Jews were required to wear armbands, which identified them as being Jewish. And you see a picture to the right, I think it is to your right, of my uncle being married, and my grandmother in the middle, and he, even during a wedding day, he wore an armband identifying him as being Jewish. So here, again, we were born in Jarkey. I was born May 2nd, 1940. I guess that makes me about 39 years old. I had a big brother, Samuel Shlomo. And Jarkey was an open ghetto. I think Debbie might have mentioned that. They were, go ahead.
Yeah, so an open ghetto, if you're not familiar, is, you think of barbed wire typically. So an open ghetto, there's no barbed wire. There are checkpoints in and out of town, but people could sleep in their own homes. It wasn't a great life, but it was a whole lot better than a lot of people had it, Jewish people had it at the time. So it was an open ghetto. There was something called forced contributions, which is code for stealing. On a regular basis, the soldiers would come door to door and ask, particularly targeting Jewish homes, and not ask, sorry, demand certain things. So on one given day it would be, give us all of your silver, or on another given day a certain sum of money, or your leather goods. And so our family did what pretty much every Jewish family did across Poland at the time. They hid as much as they could. And in our case, it was the backyard. The family dug, my dad's father, Israel Bornstein, dug a pit and reinforced it in the backyard and put family heirlooms and money. And they really, at this point, honestly felt the war would be quick and they would be able to, they would have their things again.
So, again, this is a picture of my father. And my father was selected to be Judenrat president. And that's not necessarily a coveted position. It's basically a go-between the Nazis and the Jewish people.
Yeah, I was nervous when we found that out because I was afraid that I was going to have to tell my father maybe some not so pleasant things about his own father, whom he doesn't really remember. Judenrat presidents were often seen as traitors because they had the role of deciding who goes on the train, who gets the terrible work assignments, who gives up certain sums of money on certain days. I mean, this was no good job. And so I was nervous. And I said to a man named Eli Zborowski, who you'll hear about again in a moment, Marlene's cousin, and our family's next door neighbor in Jarkey, Poland. Well, actually, we'll get to that story in a minute. What he shared with us, I said to him one day, can you just tell me honestly? He's a little older than my father. He remembers my grandfather well. I'm not going to be upset. I didn't know this man. Can you just tell me, was he a good man or not? My grandfather Israel. And he snapped at me. Marvin snapped at me and said, "Don't you ever, ever try to imagine that you could understand the weight that was on your grandfather's shoulders." And he said, he shared a story with me that is not in the book, but he does know that we talk about it when we give talks, and he's okay with it. He asked me not to put it in the book because he didn't want people continually, it's hard for him to talk about. He was on a work detail. He was about 13 or 14 years old, and you can tell the story.
Marvin, who actually, he and his brother started Yad Vashem International. So he was basically on a work detail. He was about 14, 15 years old. And he must have had a fever, he was sick, couldn't get out to work. Nazis came in, put a pillow over his head, took him to jail, and the sentence was death. My father came in, he bribed the Nazis, and saved his life. And again, Marvin's going to be 90 sometime this summer. He's still alive. He's got all his brain functions, so we know that's true.
Marvin shared this photo with us. That's him on the top left, the tall, skinny kid on the top left. And Marvin happens to be a man with a lot of worldly possessions, but when he shared this with me and I took it out of his home to scan it, he said, "Debbie, do not hurt this photo." I don't think I've ever been so nervous to drive with something before. This is one of his most prized possessions on earth. During the ghetto years, of course, children couldn't go to school, And his father, Moshe Zborowski, was really upset about that, so Moshe used his secret pot of money to pay this teacher on the bottom right there. That was their teacher, to school these children secretly. That was his girlfriend next to the teacher, Sasha, he said. The reason Marvin cherishes this photo so much is because he's the only survivor from this photo. The entire class was murdered in the Holocaust, including the teacher. The bribery scheme was actually, my grandfather, as it turns out, had set up this bribery scheme where he was saving people like Marvin, but saving lots of people in the town and getting fake papers so that people could escape and encouraging people to go underground. And the bribery scheme was also able to help Żarki stay an open ghetto. It was one of the last open ghettos in all of Poland. But eventually, word came from higher up that the town would be made Juderein, which is German for clean of Jews. The town was liquidated. And ultimately in 1943, my dad and his mom and my dad and his dad and mom and his big brother Samuel and his grandmother Dora, his dad's mother, were all taken to the Pionki labor camp. And I watched a video of my grandmother that my dad had recorded in the 1980s where he said, so tell me about Pionki. And my grandma Sophie had some dementia at that point. She had Alzheimer's. And my grandma Sophie looks off in the distance and she says, oh, Pionki was such a beautiful place. It was such a wonderful place. And I thought, okay, grandma was losing it there, you know? And then I started doing more research and learned that relatively speaking, Pionki was a pretty incredible place. Yes, they lived in barbed wire. It was a labor camp and they lived within barbed wire. But there was a man who ran the factory. It was attached to a munitions factory, a huge munitions factory where they packed bullets. And the man who ran the camp was a German civilian named Hauptmann Brent. They called Hauptmann leader Brent. And Hauptmann Brent felt terribly about what was happening to the Jewish people. So he made sure that within that barbed wire space where they lived, they had all the food they could want. They'd been so hungry coming from the ghettos. They had all the food they could want. They had soap. They had toothpaste, things that are like gold at this point to them, right? They had access to hygiene. And something really precious, they had information. He would bring his radio out to the factory floor and he would let them hear what was going on and give them some hope about what was going on in the war. In one particular case, there was one survivor who was at Pionki who, her father was also there. Her father was elderly. And her father was getting incredibly sick, and the long days on the factory floor, she was very worried that he couldn't take it anymore. So she marched herself into Hauptmann Brent's office, assuming that she could potentially be killed for mouthing off to a superior, a German civilian, the German superior. But she didn't know what else to do, so she marches into Hauptmann Brent's office and she begged, please, please do something. My father can't go on like this. The next day, the man was moved to a desk job in the office at Pionki. He was, by all accounts, a good man. But word came down one day in the summer of 1944 that Pionki would be made Juderein, clean of Jews. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Hauptmann Brent sent word to Auschwitz where the trains were going. And he said, these are the best trainloads of workers in the world. You keep them alive. Now, my dad was a 4-year-old boy, so he wasn't working anywhere, of course. But did those trainloads receive some extra grace? I can tell you this much. We have spoken to archivists, historians around the world. Nobody can explain why my dad is standing here alive today. There is no good reason why a 4-year-old boy entered at that point in the war and lived. In fact, he was numbered. He was given a number and taken to the children's barracks. His number, Yad Vashem told us, is one of the last numbers ever given out. Because after that, they sped up the extermination process and just took everybody right to the gas chambers. My dad did live.
So here we have a picture of Jewish people, including myself, being herded to cattle cars. And we have a story of my grandfather, again, going into these crowded, cramped cattle cars, which sometimes took days to get to a concentration camp. And my grandfather actually died going to one of those camps. So here you have the front of Auschwitz, It says, Arbeit macht frei, which means work will make you free. That's probably the farthest from the truth. Yeah.
So, of course, you've probably heard of the selection gate, where they decide who lives and who dies. Again, there's no perfect explanation. We will probably never know exactly why my dad is standing here. Maybe Nes Gadol, we don't, there's no great explanation. But he lived, and he was taken initially to the children's bunk. There was a children's bunk at Auschwitz-Birkenau that was near the women's barracks, and they said goodbye, the family said goodbye there at the selection gate because my dad's father and his big brother Samuel, who was 5 years older than him, they were taken to the men's side of camp. And my dad and his mom and his grandmother Dora were taken to the women's side of camp. And he was placed in a bunk, so 4 or 5 kids at a time would smush into one of these bunk beds, I guess you would call it. It's a wood plank. If you were lucky, you got straw. And the truth is, my dad probably would have died there were it not for my very spunky grandmother's courage.
And that's one of the miracles we have, that again, the other children in the children's bunk were starving as well, and they were older. They would take my bread rations, and I would have starved to death if it wasn't for my mother. She came in to the children's bunk. She was beaten over the head. She showed me scars that she had for being beaten over the head, and she shared some of her bread and smelly potato soup with me.
She would come as regularly as she could, but she couldn't get there every evening. And at some point she decided that my dad would die if he stayed there much longer. So she took another huge risk, and she smuggled him into the women's bunk one night. And you have to remember there are hundreds of women in every bunk, and they all could have been killed for hiding a child. Nobody said a word. There was an unwritten code at Auschwitz, especially on the women's side of camp. You look after the children. They did what they called organizing. It was stealing, basically. If they worked in the garden, you would organize food and you would bring it to the children whenever you saw the children. Or you would organize spoons. Spoons were a hot commodity because you could, actually eat. You could drink water from puddles. I mean, a spoon was a coveted thing to have, and they would organize and give what they could to the kids. Once she had my dad, sort of safely-ish, with her, she wanted to know, of course, how was Samuel, her older son. And so one day she was able to work near the electrified fence that separates the men's and the women's side of camp. And, sorry, my kids just walked in. But, so she approached some men who were on the opposite side of the fence, and she said, Israel and Samuel Bornstein from Zharki, Poland, can you please find out what happened to them? How are they? And she found out by the end of the day that they had been murdered in the gas chambers. And my grandma Sophie said that she just decided she was done. She had enough. And she looked at the electrified fence and decided she wanted to throw herself against the fence. And before she did, she stopped herself because she knew she still had one child left. Now her only child that she had to protect. So she went back to the children's bunk. We haven't been able to find the exact date. I still hope to find it one day, but at some point, my dad was in Auschwitz, as I said, July of 1944, so he was in Auschwitz for 6 months. Somewhere along the way, my grandmother Sophie was actually selected to be moved to an Austrian labor camp where there was a munitions factory. She had skills from working in the Pionki labor camp, and she was healthy. She had come from Pionki where they all came in a lot healthier and fatter and had lived an okay life for the last year and a half. And so she was selected to be moved, which is fantastic news for anybody at Auschwitz, except for the woman who's hiding a child there. She didn't have a choice, she had to leave. So she said goodbye to my dad, assuming that she would probably never see him again, and left him in the care of his grandmother Dora, that's Grandma Dora, and she would keep him hidden during the day under straw. She said he was a very good hider. And then on January 27th, 1945, I'm sure you'll recognize this clip.
Und dort von Mengen suchte sich unter ihnen eine bestimmte Kategorie aus. Alle, die sich hier als Überlebende sehen, sind Zwillinge.
This is my father right here.
Sie wissen nicht, wie sie heißen. Sie kennen ihre Familie nicht. Nur
That's the video, by the way, that's captioned on a Holocaust deniers website. Pretty healthy children for a, quote, death camp. There's another clip like this that's captioned. This video shows the fallacy or the lies that Jews have been telling that children were killed on arrival.
And Debbie actually is a member of the deniers.
It's now a private group, so I had to become a member, so gotta keep your enemies close, right? So that I can... What's that?
Which one is he?
Oh, my father is the one right there on the bottom right. The little boy on the bottom right. Yeah. And the first time my father saw that was actually in the 1980s. He went to see a movie called The Chosen. You're probably somewhat familiar with the movie The Chosen, right, based on a Chaim Kozak book. In the movie, the two main characters go to see a movie. It takes place in 1945, and they use a real news clip. My dad's sitting there in the theater, and he was pretty stunned.
Yeah, they had a close-up of my tattoo, and I said, "That's me," and I didn't know that picture existed. So I called the producer. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, I want to start rolling your next picture." I didn't All I wanted was a copy. That was time before DVDs and so on. And he wouldn't talk to me again, but my wife and I got this big movie camera, went into the theater, and the theater owner let me take pictures.
So this background you'll probably recognize from that video that you just saw, right? That's the background and the fence and everything. In September, we pretty much kicking and screaming dragged my father to Poland because we wanted to go there as a family with him. And the docent that was showing us around asked my father to walk this same path so they could videotape it. But we decided as a family that this time when he walked it, he would have his family by his side. So we took what felt like maybe the longest walk of our lives. Oops.
While you're doing that, Debbie's husband Steve is here, and Katie.
So it's okay. It looks like walking. That's what it looks like. It's great. Yeah. So it was, I think in the end you would agree it was the right decision to go?
Yes, I do. I was kicking, I didn't want to go back to Auschwitz. We went to Warsaw and Auschwitz, Bujarki, where the mayor had an Israeli flag and a Polish flag, and he hugged me. He was my best friend. So,
yeah, it was a really nice welcome. It was a reminder that there are people fighting the good fight there. This is a photo of my grandmother Dora carrying him out of Auschwitz. A lot of you may know that this was actually staged, that video and these photos, because the Soviets realized they hadn't documented the moment of liberation, and so they went back days later and asked everybody to put their prisoner uniform back on and filmed them going out. We wondered for a really, really long time, why was my dad there for that liberation moment? Because as you probably have heard, there was a death march, right? The Nazis knew they were losing, the SS knew they were losing, and so they marched more than 60,000 prisoners into the woods. This is January. Most of them had no coats, some had no shoes, they didn't have food, they marched for weeks on end. A 4-year-old boy and his grandmother Dora, they were not surviving that march. But they didn't go on the march, why were they there? And documentation we found at Yad Vashem actually revealed that my dad had been snuck into the infirmary at the time of the death march.
yes,
Go ahead.
grandmother took me to the infirmary. I was sick. What was the disease?
Dystrophy, it says
Dystrophy.
he was being treated for
And,
dystrophy.
she didn't know there was going to be a death march, but she brought me there into the infirmary, and as it turns out, it was just another miracle that we had.
The timing saved his life.
Yad Vashem in Israel has this information, and they have my tattoo number. telling the story.
So, of course, where are they going to go when they're liberated? But back to Żarki, right? My grandmother Dora took my dad back to Żarki, thinking that they would find nobody left. And they found my grandma, shortly after they arrived, my grandma Sophie came back. She survived the Austrian labor camp. This is the two of them reunited. But she was a little surprised that they weren't living in the family house anymore.
Yes, when we came back to Poland, my grandmother wanted to go back to the house that we had, and the Polish people took the house over, and she didn't have any place to stay. So she took me to a farm, and we stayed in a chicken coop with a board over our heads, and my mother found us in that chicken coop in Żarki, Poland. So she was just appalled, even though Auschwitz was terrible. She didn't like us living under those conditions.
And there were some more reunions as well. I mentioned that my grandmother Sophie had 6 brothers and sisters. That's Grandma Sophie on the top right. One sister was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek, Skarżuszko, and Buchenwald, and then was led on a death march out of Buchenwald. Another sister was in Warsaw, fled to Vilno, and then ultimately trekked across Siberia, got paperwork from the famous Japanese statesman Chiune Sugihara, and made it to Japan. Several brothers went into hiding. All 7 siblings survived.
They all survived, which is really unnerving.
Unbelievable. In a town that had 3,400 Jews before the war, only, Marvin tells me, 27 came home, and it was mostly our family. One other story, so that's my Aunt Hilda, my grandmother's littlest sister in the center, who had been in Majdanek, Skarżuszko, Buchenwald, and Warsaw. That's my dad with the bald head. He was severely malnourished, and for a long time his hair was constantly falling out. And next to my grandma Sophie is her brother Sam and his wife Sasha. So as I mentioned, the siblings all went different ways, right? Nobody knew which path led to survival. Sam and Sasha decided to go into hiding, and there was a farmer on the outskirts of town, a little village called Bobolice, and the farmer said he would take them in, along with several relatives. But they wouldn't take their daughter, Ruth, the little girl there with the bow. They said, listen, if Ruth cries and someone's coming through, at the time she's barely 3 years old, you know, we're all gonna be killed. And Sam and Sasha knew that that was right. And so they made plans to hand Ruth off to a former maid who had worked in their home and whom they trusted. And so they make plans for this handoff. Eli Zborowski is there at the time, who's Ruth's big cousin, Marvin's big brother. And Marvin went along for that handoff, and thank God he did, because he says it was just a gut feeling. It was nothing more than a gut feeling. He said, something is not right. Follow her. And so they did. They followed, and they watched as this woman, who had taken a large sum of money for keeping Ruth, wove through the town, thought she was out of sight, plunked Ruth down in a snowbank on the side of the road, and walked away. So they scooped her up, and they brought her back to the farmhouse attic. There were ultimately 10 people hiding there in that attic, some families, some not. Every one of them later said that they would be haunted till the day they died by the sounds of Ruth crying. Even in her sleep, she would cry, please don't take me from my mommy, don't take me from my mommy. Which is a mother, she knew though, that she would have to be sent away again. And so they made plans again. They had, the family had a leather factory in town, and they worked with a bootmaker, a man named Boyanek. Boyanek had 5 boys, and he and his wife always wanted a little girl. And so they said they would take Ruth in and raise her as their own for a sum of money in regular payments. And so they took Ruth in, and they renamed her Christina, because of course that's a much better Catholic name. And they loved her very much. They had her there for several months, and on a regular basis, big cousin Eli, who's there in that photo, you would guess Eli's the man in the carriage on the right? But it's actually the woman next to him. Eli used to dress up as a farm maiden so that he wouldn't be recognized. People in town, the neighbors would know who he was, and so they could have pointed him out to the Nazis. So he would go dressed as a farm maiden. He was so foolish one day as to stop for a photo. He's a teenager because nobody else would have stopped for this photo. But he used to go and make regular payments, and he shows up one day, and Boyanek and his wife say, oh my gosh, we're so sorry, but Ruth is not here anymore. They got scared. They heard of a family in town caught harboring Jews. It was all killed. And they got scared. And so they said, don't worry, we're sure she's safe. We took her to Częstochowa, the town my dad first pointed out in that map, north of Żarki. We took her to Częstochowa, where there's the Church of the Black Madonna, my dad mentioned, and a web of monasteries and church orphanages. And they left her outside one church orphanage, and they said, we know the nuns will take her in, and we are sure she'll be safe. And Sam and Sesha lived out the rest of their days in hiding for 2.5 years, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead. When Żarki was liberated, January 18th, 1945, the first thing they did was they literally hopped on the back of a train and went to Częstochowa. And they go to this orphanage. And the Mother Superior says, and there's actually a lot more in the book about how they knew which daughter, how they could prove that which daughter was theirs, which girl was theirs. But they said, the Mother Superior said, you can't all go in at once. Eli was there, Sam was there, Sesha was there. You're going to scare her. So one person. So Sam says, I'm her father, I'm going in. Sam goes in. She hasn't seen him since she's barely 3 years old. And he's been in hiding, he's bearded, he's disheveled. And she freaks out. You're not my father. She's screaming and crying, you're not my father, you're not my father. And he comes out very upset. And the Mother Superior says to Sesha, you go in. So Sesha goes in, and she starts to sing, Aleph, Bet, Bet, Aleph, Bet, Bet. And it's a song that she had sung to Ruth when she was a little girl. And Ruth remembered, and she knew she wasn't an orphan anymore. Today, Ruth lives here in Florida. She has 3 kids of her own. She lives at Morse Life, where we're going to be speaking actually on Sunday. One thing I thought was interesting is Yafa, her daughter, came with us to Poland, and she was telling us, Yafa is a Hebrew name. She was given a Hebrew name. She gave all her kids Hebrew names. She was lived a very Orthodox life, a very devout Jew, Ruth. However, when Yafa was cleaning out her drawers to move her to Morse Life, she said, you won't believe what I found. Rosary beads and crosses in the backs of all of her drawers. She still remembered that piece of her. And I just thought that was really special to know. She honored her religion so much, but she never forgot that faith that saved her. And there's another piece in the book about how a cross of Ruth's saved my dad and her life.
There are a few people standing up. There are seats around if you want to just find some chairs and have a seat.
They're my pieces.
Okay. In 1945, we moved to Munich, Germany. I was sick. I didn't have any hair, as we mentioned, malnutrition, and my mother wanted to find doctors for me and also to get a visa to the United States. So we lived in München and Munich, Germany for 5 years, my mother got assistance from HIAS, Jewish organization, from Ort, where she learned to be a hat maker. When we came to the U.S., hats were out of vote already, and we got care package that we cherished a lot. So in February 1951, we sailed. It wasn't a destroyer. It was the
USNS General M.B. Stewart. It was a U.S. transport ship that brought them here.
It took about 7 days and 7 nights, and I was throwing up for about 7 days and 7 nights. And when we came to the U.S., my mother was very worried that the U.S. immigration wouldn't let us in because I had a high fever. I was sick, but she had some power, talking power, to manage to get us in. So there's a picture of me as a DP, as a homeless person, coming into the United States in February 1951. And there we have PS6, which was, we lived near my aunt who was in a good neighborhood, and she got me into PS6. I didn't speak any English. I had a funny tattoo on my hand, and kids just never talked to me.
But then just before the book came out, I got a call from someone who had heard we were speaking somewhere, and she said, "Is your father Michael Bornstein? Is he alive today?" I said, "Yes." She's one of the girls in this photo. My dad, by the way, is second row from the bottom, second from the left. And she said, "Well, I'm planning a reunion, a PS6 reunion, a sixth grade reunion, and we'd love for him to come." We all remember that there was a little boy in our class with a tattoo on his arm. And they dug up an article and they found us. And so he said to my mom, "I don't know why they're even calling me. Nobody ever spoke to me. I was invisible there." But they decided to go and said that it was actually a really, really special night because they were such a supportive group, and they said that they look back. I actually asked one if I could use some quotes from her in the book because she had emailed me afterwards, that they look back with guilt now because nobody ever said anything. This was a totally different time. We talk about the Holocaust thanks to people like you guys now, but people didn't talk about it then. Some of the students said that they saw the tattoo, but they didn't know what to say about it. Some of them said they had no idea. They just didn't know. Teachers never said anything, but they look back with guilt, and it's a story I tell my kids a lot because I know I was never a mean kid. I was never bullied anybody. But would I have gone that extra mile to talk to the loner, the different kid with no father and no money that didn't fit in, didn't speak the language? Would I go for the extra mile in sixth grade? I don't know if I would have, honestly, if I'm being honest. And so I try to remember that,
Now these people
wonderful.
have been wonderful. One of them is worked at the New York Supreme Court. They had me speak at the New York Supreme Court Rotunda. And, it's a completely different story. So in 1957, I became a U.S. citizen, and that is one of the proudest days of my life because there are many, many countries that we visited, but I can't think of a better place to live in than the U.S. Israel is great, but I'm glad you agree with me. So in 1958, my mother actually remarried. You saw a picture of my Aunt Hilda. She couldn't get into the United States, so she was in Cuba. She introduced my mother to someone, and when I was starting college, she moved to Cuba and remarried, so I was homeless again. And Fordham was great. They put me up in an infirmary because they didn't have any dormitories left. I had an 8-foot cross in front of my bed. I got a scholarship from Fordham. Fordham was a Jesuit school. Scholarship from New York State. I became a busboy, a waiter, a head waiter, anyway, to make some money. And then went to the University of Iowa getting a pharmacy degree. I'm still a licensed pharmacist, but I haven't practiced pharmacy in about 50 years. So I received a PhD, a doctorate from Iowa in pharmaceutics, analytical chemistry, biochemistry, and I got something else at Iowa. My wife, Judy, Judy was studying special education at Iowa, and so we met and we married.
And this is the family 70 years later, except it's I'm as bad as Lauren here. It's minus one child. We're waiting till flu season is over so we can see the new baby and take a proper family picture now with the 12th grandchild. But we look at this photo, and you can look at this photo and see it two different ways. From one survivor, our Pesach table, our Hanukkah, look at what my father created, right? From one survivor, 6 million Jews were killed. What might have been? What might have been for each one of them? But we also look at it, and I feel such pride because standing in that group and somewhere in the room too is Jack Samuel Hollenstadt, named after my dad's brother. I am Debbie or Dvorah, named after my grandmother Dora, who hid and kept my father safe. My sister, second from right there, is Lori Eileen, the I for Israel, named after my dad's father. My little Ellie Sophia back there is named after my grandma Sophie. And, you know, there's just so much pride in knowing what this one survivor created, and we feel incredibly blessed. One more thing I wanted to mention too is, I mentioned that makeshift vault at the beginning the family created like everybody else in Poland. And so the house was taken, as you know, by a Polish family. That's totally yours, Mom. Oh my God, you're the least behaved speakers you will ever find. So sorry. Lauren could kill me. I'm so sorry. Yell at her.
Down the sides, you need to pocket.
Help your Nana. Help your Nana. Baby, help Nana.
Go ahead,
I'll wait till it's okay. Can't ring forever, can it? How many rings do you allow them? Oh, it's his fault. Oh, it is his fault. So the family had created this makeshift vault, right? But the house was taken. If you knew my Grandma Sophie, she was getting her stuff back. My Grandma Sophie went into the backyard one night before she left Żarki, and she dug and she dug, and she found the makeshift vault. But everything had been stolen, except for one thing.
And the one thing that she found was this Kiddush cup. I don't think I have to explain to anyone here what a Kiddush cup is, but we're very, very lucky to have it. Even though it had things in it, it was at our wedding, our kids' weddings, our bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, and many other happy occasions. So we really treasure this cup.
Go ahead, Jen.
One of the things my mother gave me was this watch, which has a gimel and a zion on it, which stands for Gam Ze Ya'avor, which means this too shall pass. So my mother was very optimistic. So if anything, things are bad, people are depressed, they have a bad day, just think of Gam Ze Ya'avor, this too shall pass, and look to the future instead of dwelling on the past.
One of the students, we were speaking at a couple schools today, and one of the students said, did you ever find out who took all of your stuff and your money? And they were very concerned about that. And we said, we don't know. We will never know, I'm sure, if it was neighbors or if it was the German soldiers. But honestly, the fact that this Kiddush cup, there's nothing more valuable. They couldn't have left anything better, right? I mean, they didn't want a Jewish artifact. I'm really surprised they didn't take it to melt down for silver, but they didn't. It was a Jewish artifact and they left it behind. All the money in the world can't replace this treasure, in my research, one thing I really, really wanted to be able to give my dad was something tangible, some memory, tangible physical thing to remind him of his brother. So I assumed I could find a birth certificate. I found paperwork on everyone in the family. And I assumed I could find his birth certificate. So we could even mark his birthday. We never thought to ask my Grandma Sophie. Why didn't we ask her for his birthday? And you won't find it in the book, unfortunately. I struck out. However, about a week or so before the book was published, we had set up a website, Survivors Club website. And someone found us, a researcher in Northern England who happens to be studying the little town of Żarki in Poland. And she happens to have access to a secret, never before seen treasure trove, still never publicly shown, treasure trove of photos that were taken before, during, and after the war by a photographer who lived in that area. His son now has those negatives. She's in contact with the son. She scanned and she sent and she scanned and she sent. And finally, together we found this. That is Samuel on the bottom right with my Grandma Sophie.
Martin Skorowski, again, who's still alive, confirms that that is Samuel.
So we thought that's where the story ended, which was a great way to end, except there was more. About 2 months after the book came out, again through the website, got an email one day from someone who said, I saw you doing an interview and I saw your book cover and I'm the little girl sitting next to you. And then we spoke with her and learned that there was another little girl who lives just miles away, who was also in that photo. So in June of this past year, Tova Friedman, Sarah Ludwig, and my dad were reunited. NBC Nightly News was there. You could Google Nightly News and Michael Bornstein and you'll pull up a really special day. The kids and the grandkids were all there. As Sarah says, the one in the middle, we're all family now. You know, we're all family now. Turns out these three have been living just miles apart, all of them just miles apart for decades, and never knew. And in November of this past year, we were giving a talk together in Michigan. The top photo there, the man on the left is Saul Schulman. He lives in Canada, but he heard about the talk and he decided to fly in. His sister-in-law lives in Detroit, and decided to fly in and come to the talk. He said, I never ever come to these talks. I don't know, I just felt compelled. Saul Schulman was hiding in the infirmary with my father. Didn't know it till he was sitting there watching. On the right is Ruth Weber. Ruth Weber was also in Auschwitz at the same time as my father, about 5 years older than him. Saul's 2 years older than my dad. And Ruth went to the Hebrew Gymnasium in Munich with my father for those years. So there have been a lot of surprises. So I think now you'll understand maybe at the beginning when I said I didn't used to be such a spiritual person, that by the end of this journey, I'm pretty deeply spiritual. It has been an honor to be able to tell my dad's story alongside him. The book was actually written for middle grade readers. Adults are always like, oh, that was the fastest book I've ever read. I'm like, it's for kids. But the truth is adults are reading it, because I stalk the Goodreads reviews, adults are reading it and enjoying it as much as kids, and we're thrilled about that. But we're especially proud to be bringing it to schools. It's part of curriculum in schools across the country now. There is you can go to the website, there is a discussion guide for teachers that's available, and we are eternally grateful to families like yours, and to Marlene, and to our friends and family who also came tonight, they're like our groupies, Holocaust groupies, is that a thing? But to you guys really for caring about this story.
Well, thank you so much.